Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you my updated ranking of Pat McGrath Mothership Palettes for the year 2022. So this is one of my favorite videos to film for the whole year because we're basically going to be talking about my all-time favorite makeup product, which is Pat McGrath Mothership Palettes. They really helped spark a lot of my interest in makeup to begin with. Every time I use Pat McGrath Motherships, they really inspire me to be more creative, and really being introduced to Pat McGrath Motherships is what got me into makeup as a form of self-expression. So I am super excited to run through with all of you my Pat McGrath Mothership collection. I do own all 10, and so we're going to be going through all 10 of them today. I will preface this by saying that I love all of these. Even for some of the ones that are low on the list, they're still among my all-time favorite makeup palettes. And so don't be turned off just by a palette being low ranked, especially if it's a color story that appeals to you and you can get it on sale from Pat McGrath's website. I would highly recommend still picking it up. Speaking of sale, I don't know when exactly this video is going to go up, but at the moment Pat McGrath is having a huge Black Friday sale. So if that's still ongoing, you can get 30 to 40% off the whole site, which is amazing for Pat McGrath products. Would highly recommend. If you do miss the sale though, she does still do a ton of sales on her website over the course of the year. Now, it's rarely going to get up to 40%, but she does frequently do 25% off sales. So don't worry if you miss it, there will still be other sales to come. And in case you guys are curious, I am wearing a full face of Pat McGrath makeup on today. If you are curious about what's on my face, definitely check out the link down below where I do a full face of Pat McGrath makeup showcasing this look. And on my eyes, I do actually have all 10 of these palettes featured. So I'll call out which shade I used as we go through today's ranking. But if you want to see actually how I put this look together, definitely check out that full face of Pat McGrath video. So without further ado, let's get into this ranking. Now, unfortunately, someone does have to come in last place, and that goes to Decadence, which is Mothership 4. So Decadence is a very unique Mothership palette. It has only shimmers in it, so no special Blitz Astral shades and also no matte shades. And so that is a big reason why it's ranking in the bottom for me, because for me personally, I really like how Pat McGrath Motherships are a one-stop shop for a full look. And Decadence, you can definitely put a full look together. In fact, if you check out my video review dedicated to Decadence, I use all of these shades to put together a look. You can also, of course, just use individual shades for a one and done look. This is a really great palette for someone who prefers more of a satin metallic to metallic sheen on the lids instead of having really glittery shades. But for me, I personally just don't find myself reaching for this palette that much. If I use it, it's generally just to pick out one of the shades, and so that just doesn't come up a whole lot. So nothing wrong at all from a quality perspective, but just not the full Mothership experience in my personal opinion. And for today's look, I use this shade over here as one of the deepening shades in the outer third of my eye look. Now in ninth place, we have Mothership 2 Sublime. Now, some of you might be surprised that this palette is ranking so low because this is a very popular color story from Pat McGrath. But for me, when I think of reaching for a Pat McGrath palette, I'm usually wanting to go for a very unique look, something I can't really get from my other eyeshadow palettes. And this color story overall is just very neutral and very common. So basically, if you take out this green shade, everything else is just a very neutral color palette. So for those of you who have been really wanting Pat McGrath to come out with a more neutral color story, this is definitely the closest thing to that you can get from her existing collection. And so if I were to use a Pat McGrath palette for just an everyday neutral look, this would probably be the one I would go for. But just so happens that for my own makeup preferences, I don't really think of reaching for a Pat McGrath palette for those sorts of looks. In addition, my favorite part of any Pat McGrath palette is the Blitz Astral shades, and these are all nice, but none of them are my favorites. So this one over here, this bronze shade, is just extremely flaky and chunky. I would recommend going in with mixing medium or her Intensifies wand if you're using this shade. And then we have this shade, which is quite pretty, this sort of like VR pink shade, but there are some of her other motherships that have a similar shade. And then this Astral Ghost Orchid is also found in Subversive, so even though I like this shade, it's not unique to this palette. And then this Blitz Emerald shade is definitely the standout, most unique shade in this palette. But for me, I just don't use this sort of shade that often. So all in all, I just don't find myself reaching for this palette as much as my other motherships. But this is the one I would most recommend to people who want that sort of everyday neutral look from Pat McGrath. And for today's look, I used this rose shade on the lower lash line as kind of the initial shade before I deepen things up. Now moving on to 8th place, this is probably a shocker for many. Honestly, this is a shock for me as well, but we have Divine Rose 1. And I say this is a shock because this was one of my most highly ranked palettes in my last rankings video. And actually even up till today, I was going to rank this pretty high, but this was sort of a last minute change for me. So, you know, this might change again. But right before I started filming this video, I was thinking about, you know, realistically, which palettes have really sparked joy for me in the past year. Not like when I first got them, but in the past year. And this palette has unfortunately just fallen down in the rankings since I first got it. So I still really love this color story, but I think over the past year, I've picked up a lot of other palettes that have sort of a related mauvey kind of cool toned color story to them. So this has become a lot less unique in my collection. I have now the Natasha Denona Retro palette, the Kashmiri palette from Viseart. And so this is no longer my go-to for this sort of color story. So when I was thinking about what palettes have I actually used in the past year, I actually have not really grabbed for this for a standalone look for a very long time. And I think there's a few factors in that. So one is, as I was mentioning, there's more competition for this sort of look. But also I would say when it comes to these Blitz Astral shades down here, they don't really stand out to me as much as some of the other motherships. So this dual chrome got me super excited when I first saw it. But on the lids, at least for me, it just translates as a gold shade. You don't really see much of that pink flip. Then this gold is kind of boring, and then this shade is really nice and unique in that it has that beautiful pink sheen to it. But now I do have several different shadows and highlights in my collection that have a similar effect, so this is now less unique. And then this Astral Solstice shade is found in Midnight Sun, and so this is not a unique shade to this palette. Also, this rose shade is found in Sublime, so also not unique. And this Skin Show shade is found in Subliminal. So in general, this palette doesn't have as many unique shades as her other palettes. And so I just haven't really found myself gravitating to picking this up and using it. Recently, when I use this palette, it's usually if I'm doing a mashup with one of my other Pat McGrath palettes. That said, if you are starting out with Pat McGrath palettes and you want this sort of mauvey neutral color story, if this is what you gravitate to whenever you're doing glam looks, then this is a gorgeous, gorgeous palette, and I would still highly recommend it for that purpose. Now, I will caveat this ranking by saying that Decadence and Sublime are definitely the bottom two for me, but for the rest of the palettes going forward, there's a lot of movement on a day-to-day basis, and it's very easy for any of these palettes to go up or down in the ranking. And for today's look, I used this matte shade in the outer corner just to deepen things up near the lash line. So that brings us to number 7, which is Midnight Sun. So Midnight Sun is a palette that's been a bit of a slow burn for me. When I first got it, I wasn't that big of a fan of the color story. It is more discordant than a lot of her color stories. Like Divine Rose 1 is basically all just one color story, whereas this is sort of like a desaturated rainbow palette. You have your red, you have your orange, you have your yellow, you have your green, you have your blue, purple. So you have all these these different colors in it. And so when I first got it, I didn't really know if I liked this color story. It looked a little ugly to me. But in the past year or so that I've had this, I've really fallen in love with this color story. Especially for the fall season, this is just such a beautiful palette. Like, I really love the look I recently did, basically using all of these earthy tones, essentially everything other than this shade. But I've also really loved the looks where I've introduced this blue. It's just a very unique combination of this very cool blue violet shade with these really rich warm tones as well. And so every time I use this palette, it feels very Pat McGrath. It feels like a curation I would not have put together on my own, but where I really, really love the effect. And in particular, some of my favorite things about this palette include this transition shade over here, which is very much a beautiful transition shade on my skin tone. It is really natural, but still has a little bit of that yellowy warmth to it. I also really love this shade that just brings that terracotta fall vibe to any sort of look. And I love this shade as well. This is actually what I have to merge the center of the lid and the outer corner together. You might be able to see a little bit of that sort of dark olivey green shade. And then this blue violet is so beautiful. And this shade, which is quite chunky, is super, super fun. This is great all over the lids if you use it with mixing liquid, but it's also great just as a scatter of copper glimmer on the lids if you use a finger and a light touch. We also have that Astral Solstice shade that was in Divine Rose 1. This is a perfect, just works with every single eye look because this is just white shimmer, and so you can just add this on top of any look. And then this shade is kind of boring, but it does tie everything together. And so I've seen this palette on sale a lot. I feel like this is one she's like been discounting the most this year for some reason. So I think it's really underrated. I would highly recommend picking this up in any of her sales. Even if this color story kind of looks confusing, you might be surprised. Like, at least I was definitely surprised. This was one of the later palettes that I picked up in my collection, but now has become one of my favorites. So here we are in 6th place with Bronze Seduction. Now, compared to a lot of folks, I feel like I ranked Bronze Seduction a bit lower because this is one of the motherships that really put Pat McGrath on the map and has since then been a cult favorite. That said, for me, if you actually watched my first Mothership rankings video, you know that this has actually gone up in the rankings since then. So I've had a very turbulent relationship with this palette. This is the only Mothership palette I've tried where I've had quality issues. And despite that, it is ranking kind of in the middle of the road above a lot of other palettes that had no quality issues. So you might be wondering what's going on. So for those of you who didn't watch my first video, basically the story behind this palette is this was actually the first Mothership palette I ever tried from Pat McGrath. I did a ton of research. It was kind of before I had gotten into luxury makeup at all. And so I was super excited to pick this up, and then incredibly disappointed when I first tried this palette. Basically, I found that these mattes were all super pigmented and really hard for me to blend with my skill set at the time. And then also this shade was like completely hard panned on arrival. And I found that this shade was also a little bit hard to work with. It was too flaky. I couldn't really pick it up with a brush. And so I was struggling a lot with this palette and actually ended up returning it and kind of concluding that maybe Pat McGrath makeup was just not for me, which I know is probably hard to believe given just how obsessed I am with Pat McGrath now. And so this palette really broke my heart, and as a result was kind of persona non grata for a while. It was another palette, which I'll talk about shortly, that really saved my interest in Pat McGrath and started this whole Pat McGrath love affair. But since then, I picked up this palette again because I needed to complete my Pat McGrath Mothership collection. And I also watched Mel Thompson's video about how to blend out the mattes in this palette, and that helped a lot. After that, I really enjoyed the looks I was getting from this palette. I still think compared to all of her other motherships, this one is a bit harder to use, at least if you have a skin tone similar to mine. I think the high pigmentation of these might be a little bit easier to work with if you have a very deep skin tone, but I do feel like there's a little bit of a quality issue as well because she does have other mattes in her other motherships that are super pigmented, but just a lot easier to work with. Like the 3 extreme black shades in her first 3 motherships are way, way, way easier to blend out than any of these 3, even though those are straight up black mattes. In addition, even though I picked up a new palette, this shade is still extremely difficult to pick up. I don't know what's going on with this shade. I basically never use it because with a finger or with a brush, it is super hard to deposit any pigment on the lids. So you might be wondering now, given that 4 of the 10 shades in this palette are not my cup of tea, why is this ranking above Midnight Sun, above Divine Rose 1, and all of these others? And the truth of the matter is, it's just that I love this quad so much, and in particular this shade right here is just so beautiful. It's what I have in the center of my lids today. And I know given that this is like $128, you can't really justify that with just like a few shades. But when it comes to just looking at my collection and which palettes do I go for the most often, the reality is I do pick this up a lot simply because I love these Blitz Astral shades so much. And then I've learned how to make these mattes work. So even though I don't like them, I can still get them to produce a nice look. And then these 2 shades are fine, perfectly easy to work with. And so on the whole, I do actually reach for this palette a lot and do really love the looks I get from it. So if you're someone who really loves the Blitz Astrals from Pat McGrath and you don't mind picking up a whole mothership primarily to get those, then I would highly recommend this palette. And if she ever releases this quad as a standalone, definitely run out and buy that. But for me, now that I have this palette in my collection, I actually do go for it quite often. Now coming in 5th place, we have Mothership 1 Subliminal. So this is the palette I was referencing earlier that started my whole love affair with Pat McGrath makeup. And in general was the palette that really expanded my horizons and made me feel like I could engage in makeup artistry even as a complete novice. And so for me, this palette will always have a very special place in my heart. For one, this is just such a unique color story. It's totally different than any other color story I have in my collection, even though in recent years I have been picking up a lot of cool toned neutrals. The blues and lavenders in this are still very unique, and I absolutely love these Blitz Astrals down here. This shade over here, which I have in my inner corners, just adds a really beautiful faint blue shine. This shade over here has a beautiful flip between blue, purple, and pink. And then this Blitz Blue shade is just one of the most beautiful blue eyeshadows that I have in my collection. It's just so pigmented and so rich, and you can either use this more as kind of a matte shade in the crease area because it's very finely milled, or you can use it all over the lid. I recently did a look with this shade in my Sephora VIB haul video, and I really loved that look. In addition, all of these shades over here are just super easy to work with. Before having this palette, I was really intimidated to go in with pure black matte shades because I was worried about blending them out too much and looking like a raccoon. But this is a really easy to use black matte, very high quality. And these shades as well over here are just very versatile. Anytime you want to kind of cool down a look, they are super blendable and look very beautiful on the lids. So I highly recommend this palette for anyone who is interested in cool tone neutrals or is interested in just kind of expanding out of the typical eyeshadow color story. You just have so many different finishes in this palette with this beautifully unique color story that I think this is a great palette to just slightly push yourself out of the box. Now for 4th place, we have Subversive. So I would say similar to Midnight Sun, Subversive is a palette I didn't expect to like as much as I do. So it's very colorful, very grungy, very dark, and so it's different from my typical color story, at least when I first got it. Since then, I feel like this has become much more the kind of color story I gravitate to whenever I think about my Pat McGrath collection. Basically, this is just a super, super fun palette. It has so many really gorgeous, shiny shades that are just such showstoppers for any look. So for today, I have this green shade over here in the inner thirds of my eyes. And I think it just adds a really beautiful, unique kind of antique green gold element to this look. And the reason this has gone up a lot in the rankings is that when I first got this, I was having a lot of issues with fallout with this palette, and so I didn't really like it that much from a quality standpoint. You can see what I mean if you watch my dedicated video to this palette. And by the way, I do have dedicated videos to each of these Mothership palettes, and in each of those videos, I use all of the shades. So if you are curious about any of these palettes, looks with them, swatches, demos of all the shades, definitely just search on YouTube for Arte and Beauty and then the name of the palette and it should come up. But despite the issues with fallout, this palette has really risen in my rankings quite a lot, just because as long as you're quite careful with the fallout issue, maybe you use a finger, maybe you use mixing liquid, or maybe you do your base afterward. The shades in this palette are just so, so beautiful. Every single look I make using this palette just makes me feel so inspired. And that's something where, as my makeup collection has expanded, I feel that less and less with new palettes. And so that's really made me gravitate more to this palette because it's very different from a lot of the color stories you see on the market today. I feel like most makeup brands, including Pat McGrath, do not necessarily go with this sort of color story. But there's just so many different directions you can go with this, and this whole quad down here is just extremely, extremely beautiful. Each of these shades is a showstopper, and this shade, which is also in Sublime, is a beautiful topper for really any sort of look. And then this shade over here, even though it's not a Blitz Astral, gives a very similar effect on the lids. Now the remaining four shades, they're fine. You know, I feel like they just kind of play a backup role, but all of these metallic shades are just incredibly, incredibly beautiful. Now, before we move on, I want you guys to guess what number one is going to be. Please leave your comment down below and don't cheat by going to the end of the video. Now moving on to third place, we have the newest Mothership palette, Mothership 10 Moonlit Seduction. Now, to be frank, I'm actually surprising myself that this is so high in the rankings. If you watched my video review of this palette, I was not so sure how much I liked this palette because the matte situation here is not necessarily the best. Basically, these two mattes look quite similar on the eyes, and then they don't necessarily blend in the best with this shade over here. So basically, this palette would have been a lot better if these two were more different, maybe if one was a lot lighter than the other. And then over here, we just have a lot of very, very flaky shimmery shades that are in a new formulation. So all of the other palettes we've talked about so far have her Blitz Astral formula that is a baked shadow, whereas these are more like indie shadows. So it's that really wet pressed shimmer formulation. And so when I first got this, I wasn't a huge fan of these changes that she made, and I didn't really know if I would get much use out of this because overall this palette does kind of steer you in one direction, which is very much kind of more of a dark vampy direction or very much a high contrast glam direction, because you don't have much optionality in terms of the mattes over here. Basically, you're going to use probably these two or these two for any sort of look. And then for the shimmers, if you use any of these shimmers, you're going to end up with a pretty neutral look where you have sort of a smoky backdrop and then one really light shimmer. And so I didn't think this was going to be the most versatile palette, but I've surprised myself in that I really, really love this palette. And in particular, I really love this shade over here. This is what I have on my lower lash line, in the inner 2/3 of my lower lash line. And basically every time I reach for this palette, I typically go in with the mattes, like I said, and then this shadow has to go on my lids, and then, you know, maybe some of the other ones as well. Similar to Bronze Seduction, I know that, you know, you can't really justify the cost of this palette just for this one shade. I'm sure you can find an indie shadow that's similar, but this is just my personal ranking, and I do find myself going for this palette so much just to build looks around this shade, and every single look I've gotten from it is just so beautiful. Every time I look at myself in the mirror, I just am so attracted to the way these shimmers look on my lids. And even though the mattes are not that unique or not that versatile, I think that's not really the point of the palette. The point is definitely all of these beautiful glossy shimmers. So here we are with it coming in third place. So coming in second place, we have Utopian Dream, which is Mothership 9. Now this palette to me is also kind of surprising in that I was so incredibly disappointed when this palette came out. So if you guys watched my video review of this palette, basically, Pat McGrath was teasing like Sailor Moon, like Rainbow Pastel, all these like colorful things. And then she came out with this, which is basically like Divine Rose 3. And so I was super, super disappointed when I first saw this. I thought, you know, we were gonna get pastel blues and greens and all this stuff. And that's obviously not featured here. But after I got over the disappointment based on my expectations, I actually really fell in love with this palette. So this is not that unique if you already have Divine Rose 1 and 2, but as a standalone palette, this is one of my all-time favorite palettes. It's just so fun. Like, you have the most fun set of Blitz Astral shades over here. Like, this shade over here has lavender, it has green, it has pink, it has gold. It's just a full-blown party on the lids. This one is more like lavender blue, and then you have this multi-chrome here that's more of a bronze to green to gold. Now this one's kind of boring, but these three are just so gorgeous. And then this one also kind of has a dual chromatic effect as well. And then these mattes really cater towards a very cute spring look. So if you go with these two, it's a little bit more muted, so you can do a bit more of a subdued look with this if you basically stick to these four shades over here. But you can also easily make it super fun by introducing any of these other shades. And so I've actually really enjoyed this palette. And this transition shade especially is one that I actually reach for a lot, even when I'm using other shimmers. And so on the whole, I think if you like that sort of fun, cute, pink, lavender, blue sort of look, then this will definitely give it to you, and is surprisingly versatile for both more everyday looks and also really fun, colorful looks. Now finally, we have first place, which is Divine Rose 2. So this palette has a special place in my heart. It's the one that I chose for my wedding day, and so it'll always be special from that standpoint. And I think this was also actually #1 last year. And so for a while I was thinking about, is it still really #1 now? Like, we've gotten some new motherships, like I've played around a lot more with her existing ones. But I have to be honest with myself, and this sort of sunset color story is just my jam. Like, I just love this palette so much. Every time I use this palette, I have so much fun, and I just really enjoy the looks that I get out of this. This is more saturated than Utopian Dream and Divine Rose 1, but you can still do looks that are not too in your face if you want to do something a little bit more natural. But at the same time, you're never going to get a boring look from this palette. There's just enough contrast between each of the shades, even though it's overall kind of rosy peachy and such, that the look will still be very eye-catching and very Pat McGrath. And so for me, that's what I love so much about this. These mattes over here are so fun to work with. They instantly give you that sort of sunset effect. This shade over here, which is what I have sort of in the outer transition area of my lids today, is a satin shimmer, but is also really easy to use as a matte. This is also a really beautiful blush on the cheeks. And I absolutely love this shade over here, Eleganza. It's one of my all-time favorite shadows, full stop. And then the Blitz Astrals are also super fun. So this multi-chrome here, Sextra Terrestrial, even though she's like since amped up her multi-chromes in her past 2 releases, I still really love this one. If you're someone who likes multi-chromes but doesn't want something that's too in your face, this will give you that flip, but in a very beautiful satin metallic finish that is quite flattering on the lids. In addition, this Astral Pink Moon is just perfect for adding that sort of rose gold shimmer on top of the lids. It works well with a wide variety of looks. These 2 shades over here are less interesting, but I think they do work well for just completing the look and adding some of that warmth back. I often use this in the inner corner, for example, whenever I'm using this palette. So on the whole, this is still my #1 palette. If you don't like sunset looks, I don't think you'll like this, but if you have similar makeup preferences to me, the quality on this palette is just impeccable. It is super, super easy to use, and the looks that you get are just incredibly pretty and beautiful. So that's it in terms of my rankings of my Pat McGrath Mothership palettes. I would love to hear in the comments below which palettes you guys are most interested in. Do you have a favorite or least favorite? As I mentioned at the top, I love all of my Pat McGrath Motherships, so even the ones that are ranking lower are still some of my all-time favorite eyeshadow palettes. If you can pick up any of her Mothership palettes on a steep discount, I would highly, highly recommend doing so. I don't think you'll regret it, and even if it's a color story that's a little bit different from what you normally go for, I would encourage you to still try it because her formulations are just so unique, and I feel like her Motherships have a way of kind of encouraging you to step out of your comfort zone because they all have enough neutrals to kind of keep the palette rooted, and there are ways to make very simple everyday looks out of them. If you're interested in that, definitely check out my ultimate guide to wearing Pat McGrath on an everyday basis. But if you want that sort of really beautiful, glam, creative look as well, there's just so many options to go into with Pat McGrath's eyeshadows. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!